start the recording. Okay, the topic is Purim, which we have been talking about. Specifically, I want to talk about matanot le'evyonim, giving charity to the poor, which is a special mitzvah of Purim, but also is a mitzvah all year long. So I want to look at the special mitzvah of Purim in the context of what in the context of the mitzvah of tzedakah all year long. Let me see if I can usually get the material on the screen. I usually get it right. There, I hope you've got it. First of all, as far as all year long is concerned, before we focus on Purim, the Shulchan Aruch says, Asur lahachzir ha'ani hashoel rekam. Poor person comes and asks for tzedakah, asks for charity. It is prohibited to send him or her away with nothing. Even if you give only the smallest amount, one date is suggested. That's enough to fulfill your basic obligation. You can't send the poor person away empty-handed, but you have to give something. Shene'amar, as it says in the verse, Al yashuv dach nichlam, shouldn't let the poor person go away with nothing, go away embarrassed. Now this creates a problem. You can have poor people swarming around you in large numbers, which happens in certain places, and where you're supposed to be handing out money to anyone who asks for it. This can become quite absurd after a while. Let's see what the contemporary post can say about the issue. Rav Yashiv, in his published Chuvot, Rav Yashiv, as great as he was and as important as he was, actually wrote very few Chuvot in his lifetime. That was not, writing Chuvot was not his area of enterprise. He wrote Piskei Din and the Rambam. He wrote a lot of other stuff, but not Chuvot, a few. Here's one Chuva, which he wrote and published. Uvdahi, it's a fact. Ki kama inchi delo male, it's a fact that there are some people who are no good out there. It's a simple fact that there are some frauds out there. Holchim go around from here to there, these frauds go around from here to there, le'esof ksafim, to gather money, to gather charity. Ubiyadam michtevei hamlatza, they're carrying letters of approbation from great rabbis, but the letters they're carrying around, the haskamot, are all just nonsense. They make no sense at all. They're just frauds, and they're waving their letters, which are all just fraudulent. There are two big problems with these fraudulent fundraisers. One, gozlim et ba'alim ha'choshvim letumam she'al yadam hem mekayimim mitzvos tzedakah. They're stealing from the people who donate to them. The donors are falsely led to believe that they're fulfilling the mitzvah of tzedakah. And these fraudulent poor people are just stealing from the donors. That's one big problem. Second big problem, chamsim et aniyim. These fraudulent donors are also cheating the real poor people, the people who are legitimately poor. How are they doing that? The people who are truly poor are hoping that the wealthy are going to come to their rescue, and ilulei haramaim. But for the fraudulent people, the truly poor would get more money, but because of the frauds collecting charity money, the poor people don't have enough to support the ones who really deserve it. So the frauds are, number one, stealing from the donors, Number two, they're stealing from the genuine poor people who are not going to get their proper share of tzedakah because there's a limit to how much the donors can give. Well, mitzvah ika livarer al elu haposhtim yad, and therefore it's a mitzvah to clarify. It's a mitzvah to verify. It's a mitzvah to investigate those who stick out their hand. It's a mitzvah to check out the people who are soliciting tzedakah. Im be'emetem zakaim lehanot mekaspe tzedakah. Don't believe wildly. Don't believe blindly. Don't just accept the fact that someone is poor because he or she says he or she is poor, just because he or she sticks out the hand soliciting tzedakah doesn't mean that they're legit. There are a lot of frauds out there, and it's a mitzvah to check out the recipient of tzedakah before you give the money. You don't want to stumble yourself and erroneously think you're doing the mitzvah of tzedakah when you're not, and you don't want to cheat the real poor people to whom you would give the money if you would just cut out the fraudulent fundraisers from the story. Now, before we go into the halacha in a little bit more detail, let me just point out that this is in concept no different than the way a business person or a farmer or anyone who wants to invest money in his or her enterprise. Yeah, you have a certain amount of money and you want to invest the money in your farm, in your factory, in your store where you're selling, in your whatever your business is, whatever your enterprise is. You have some money and you want to invest in it to improve your business. You'll be very careful how you spend that money. You want to spend that money, you want to invest it in the way that will give you the best profits, the way that'll benefit your enterprise the best. And similarly in tzedakah, you have a limited amount of funds which you're going to invest in the mitzvah of tzedakah. You want to check out very carefully where that money is going to make sure that you will have the best tzedakah investment, the best mitzvah investment you can have. Rav Yoshev instructs us not to blindly assume, not to naively assume that someone is deserving without investigating that person. Now, that's the general idea. Let's see how this plays out in specific cases in the Shulchan Aruch. Here are the words of the Shulchan Aruch. Misha Bava Amar. Poor person comes and says as follows: Ha'achiluni, I need food. I need food. If that's what the poor person is asking for, if the poor person is asking for food, ein bodkin acharav, you don't take time to investigate. You don't take time to question the poor person. You don't take time to check the person out. Imhu ramai. You don't worry about whether the person is a fraud if he or she is begging for food. Ella, instead, ma'achalino tomiyad. Instead, you feed the person right away. Okay, so if it's a question of starvation, there we don't take time for investigation. On the other hand, haya aron. On the other hand, if the poor person has no clothing, the Bava Amar and says, Kasuni, give me clothing to wear. Bodkim acharav, you don't give him clothing to wear until you check out the poor person's situation to be sure that he or she really needs the support. Imu ramai, you have to make sure the person is not a fraud. So there's a difference between someone who's starving. Well, that's a need which cannot wait. And therefore, you don't take time to investigate whether or not the person is a fraud. Anything which can wait, investigate. Check out the person. Make sure that the person is not fraudulently soliciting money. Of course, you might know the poor person and know that the person is deserving of needs clothing. Well, if you already know the person, so you don't have to do any further investigation. But if you don't know the person, investigation is required. If you know the situation that person is in, well, there's no need to investigate because you already know the facts. Bottom line, according to the Shulchan Aruch, investigation, checking out whether or not the poor person is worthy, is absolutely required in cases where you can delay support until the examination, the investigation has taken place. And of course, you don't need to investigate if you already know the facts. Well, it turns out that what Rav Elyashiv told us, there are a lot of frauds in the world, and therefore you should not naively assume that someone who asks for money is legitimately poor. It turns out to be just echoing the words of the Shulchan Aruch. It's not surprising that Rav Elyashiv would paskin like the Shulchan Aruch. What is slightly surprising is that he would bother to publish a Chuva about it. There's a great Rav Belsky. Rav Belsky was the Rosh Yeshiva in Torah Vodaas in New York, and among other things, Rav Belsky was the posek of the OU Kashrus organization in the United States. That's the largest hechsher in the world, and well, as you know perfectly well, bugs in food constitute the biggest bugaboo of contemporary kashrus. Today, people really go crazy over insect infestation in food. It's something that people are really very bothered about, to the extent that rabbis give their hechsher, give their approval only to certain kinds of fish, which are free of worms, free of infestation. And this is a little bit mysterious, because it says in the Torah, "Sheretz hashoretz al pnei ha'adama," only an insect which creeps and crawls upon the earth is prohibited, and therefore the Gemara concludes right away that a worm, a creepy crawly, which never crept and crawled upon the earth, is permitted, and therefore the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch say that if there's a worm in the flesh of the fish, that worm is permitted. Why is it permitted? Because it obviously never did creep and never did crawl upon the earth. And therefore, the Shulchan Aruch says worms in the flesh of the fish are permitted. And nonetheless, in the world of kashrus today, they make big fusses about this. And well, there's a lot of fuss being made. Rav Belsky went to Rav Moshe Feinstein and asked him whether or not there's any reason for the OU, the kashrus agency, to be concerned about infestation of worms in fish. And Rav Moshe Feinstein said, no, that's no concern. And of course, they can give their approval to fish, even if there's a chashash, even if there's some fear that there's some worms in the fish. Then Rav Belsky asked Rav Moshe Feinstein, could you please give me a written Chuva regarding your lenient opinion? To which Rav Moshe Feinstein replied, no, I'm not going to write a Chuva about something which the Shulchan Aruch explicitly permits. It's just a waste of time. Well, Rav Moshe was not interested in taking the time to write a Chuva about something which the Shulchan Aruch explicitly says. Rav Elyashiv, on the other hand, had no objection, apparently, to publishing this Chuva about all the Ramaim in the world, and therefore you should not give tzedakah to a poor person until you investigate that poor person. Well, it's not his original idea. He's just echoing exactly what it says in the Shulchan Aruch, as we see. And if it's a question of starvation, then we don't run the risk of the person starving to death while we're doing the investigation. That's sort of obvious. And you just feed the person right away. Now, the leading contemporary authority on these matters is Rav Yeshaya Blau. And in his Sefer, Tzedakah U'Mishpat, he says as follows: B'mizonot ein lo livdok. Someone who is begging for food because he or she is starving, no investigation is required. You just feed the person. Nir la'ani adati, it seems, in my humble opinion, he writes, Kol zeh kishemevakesh ochel u'ma'achlin oto. We forego the investigation if the poor person is begging for food and wants to eat. Aval, im hu ba levakesh ma'ot litzorchei ochel. But if the poor person is begging for money to buy food, then investigation is called for. If the poor person is begging for money to buy food, that's sufficient proof that it's not an emergency situation for this moment. The person is really starving and needs food now. That's the person that requires no investigation. We just feed that person. The person who comes who are begging for money so that he or she can buy food, well, it's obviously not so pressing at the moment, and therefore there's time for investigation. Okay, we've learned an important klal. And let me point out in passing that the Shulchan Aruch repeats all of this twice. Once in the context we've just spoken about, having to do with private individuals giving charity to private individuals. Then this whole story is repeated again when the Shulchan Aruch is talking about the Gabbai Shel Tzedakah, the charitable organization which is raising money from the public to distribute to the poor. Well, exactly the same rules apply to the Gabbai Shel Tzedakah, the Gabbai Shel Tzedakah who is distributing money from the public charity fund should not support anyone until the person has been investigated to be sure that there's no fraud involved. Let's go one step further. The Aruch HaShulchan, as you know, one of my favorites, he quotes the Gemara, Bodkin l'ksut, then bodkin l'mizonot. If the person only is begging for clothing, investigation is required. If it's for food, no investigation required. Klomar, this means, zehu vadai d'ramai ein notnin klal. If we know that the person is a fraud, of course you don't give him a penny. Ach, be'ein yadua im ramai hu im lav. But if you simply don't know whether or not this person is a fraud, someone who is not starving to death can wait a little bit for the support until he or she gets investigated, checked out, and determined to be legitimately needy. I remember I was once with my grandchildren in a pizza shop here in Yerushalayim, in Geula. And my grandchildren were having pizza, and this bag lady comes into the shop, pushing a shopping cart, wearing rags, pushing a shopping cart. Apparently, all her earthly possessions are in this shopping cart she's pushing in front of her, and she goes from table to table, soliciting charity, and people give her. As she's about to leave the pizza shop, the guy behind the cash register calls out, "Rosie, That's a guy, I guess that's her name, because she turns around and the guy behind the cash register holds up $100 bill, an American $100 bill, and says, Rosie, yesh lach lifrot, can you change this into shekels for me? And Rosie says, sure. And she goes over and she reaches under and she takes out this huge wad of shekels, takes the hundred American $100 bill and counts out shekels to say she's a walking bank. Obviously, no immediate need of support. She's walking around with a pile of money in her pocket. That's the kind of person who requires investigation before giving tzedakah. In merakesh lechem, someone who's begging for food. Someone who's starving to death. Well, we don't expect that person to wait. Anyone who begs for food, we give food, not money to buy food. Even if it's a non-Jew who is starving and begging for food, not nimlo, we give him or her. That's exactly what it says in the Gemara. Mifarnesin aniye akum im aniye Yisrael mashum darchei shalom. We support the non-Jewish poor, just like the Jewish poor, because of darkei shalom, in order to maintain good relations between the Jews and the other nations. We support the non-Jewish poor together with the Jewish poor in the same way. Lav dafka imane Yisrael, when the Gemara says we support the non-Jews with the Jews, the non-Jewish poor with the Jewish poor, we're not talking about they come together, physically together in a group. Even if the non-Jew comes alone, we give him or her, just as we would give a Jewish person. Even if the Jewish person occasionally sins and is less than a perfect tzaddik, I suppose this is, of course, very unusual. Most Jews are perfect tzaddikim and never sin at all. But even if we know that the poor person who is begging occasionally sins, even if we've seen it ourselves, we still support the person. We have to make sure that person can continue to live as part of the community. Even if the person commits a sin, the person is still our brother or sister, still our sibling, and therefore we support them. When do we continue, under what circumstances do we continue to support sinners? If we're talking about random, occasional sins. But if someone is a perpetual, regular sinner, sinning all the time, even though the person is sinning because he or she is not rebellious against God, but just has hunger for something, we're not obligated to give charity to that person. We're not obligated to lend money to that person. Nonetheless, even for the worst sinners among the Jewish people, if you want to support that person, there's no prohibition to do so. But the mitzvah, the obligatory mitzvah of giving tzedakah is just to people, giving tzedakah to poor people who are righteous, even if they sin occasionally, but not if they're habitual sinners. Kivan Chosin the Taiwan, as long as we're not talking about someone who is rebellious against Torah. Someone who commits sins because he or she is anti-Torah, because he or she is rebelling against God, that person we do not support at all. Assuming that no tshuva was done. Once tshuva has been done, then of course the person is 100% kosher again and deserving of support. The question, of course, arises, how do you know whether or not someone who has committed a sin has done tshuva? Take a person who at one stage in his or her life is strongly anti-Torah, rebellious against God, and now says, he or she now says, I've done tshuva. How are you supposed to know whether or not the tshuva is legit or whether it too is a fraud? Of course, only HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows what's going on in the person's heart, but we can judge whether or not a person has done tshuva by looking at the person's actions. And here are the examples in the Gemara. Once you understand the examples in the Gemara, you'll be able to apply the idea broadly in ordinary cases. Imagine, for example, the Gemara says that someone's sin was that he lent out money on interest. And now he does tshuva, and he's not going to charge ribis, not going to charge ribit, not going to charge interest anymore. He realizes it was wrong. How can we know that he has done tshuva? If we see that he tears up the loan agreements, which have ribis, which have interest written in them. We see that he has done something to demonstrate his tshuva. What about the butcher who has sold treif meat, claiming that it is kosher, and now says, "Oh, I've done tshuva. You can trust me again." How are we supposed to know whether or not that person has done tshuva? Well, only a Kodesh Baruch Hu can look into his heart, but we can look at his actions. If he's willing to forego his profits, give away meat for free to people who need it, well, if he's willing to forego his profits, rather like the money lender who was willing to tear up his loan agreements, were willing to forego those loans, well, his actions demonstrate that he has done tshuva, and that is acceptable. Okay, what we've seen up till this point is ein nonim pruta la'ani ad shebodkim acharav. You don't give a penny to the poor person until you've investigated to make sure that the person is not a fraud. That's in general all year long. Now let's turn to Matanot Levyonim, to the specific Purim situation. What it says in the Gemara is Migbat Purim lePurim, money which the community raises for Purim, the local Kupa Shel Tzedakah, the local charity fund which raises money for Purim, that money cannot be diverted to any other purpose. It has to be used on Purim. Migbat ha'ir lo ta'ir, money which is raised for the poor of one specific city should go to the poor people of that city. But if it's not a Purim situation, one need not be absolutely precise, and the charity fund, which has raised money to support the poor in this neighborhood or this town or this city, if they see fit to disperse some of the money to poor people elsewhere, they're entitled to do so, but not for Purim. If the money was raised for Purim, it has to be dispersed for Purim and no other time during the year. Now, what's so special about Purim that the money that was contributed to the poor fund must be used only for that purpose and cannot be diverted for any other purpose? Well, why is Purim different? The Rosh says, Af al gav de amrinin be'erch in demot tzedakah mutar l'shanot anu mitzvah acheret, even though in general money devoted to the charity fund can be diverted to other mitzvah purposes, even if the checks have been cashed and the cash is in the hands of the treasurer of the charity fund. Purim is different. Purim is different. And why is Purim different? Why must the money designated for Purim be used only for Purim and not diverted to any other purpose? Because the money which is going to the poor people on Purim is fundamentally different than tzedakah all year long. Tzedakah all year long is a mitzvah, and the money can be used for other mitzvahs. For Purim, on the other hand, the whole purpose of the donation is to increase Simchat Purim. And you can increase Simchat Purim only on Purim, not other times of the year. Va'afilu yesh lahem ma'ot harbe, if the poor fund collected far more money than they need, kulam yiknu tzachei sudas Purim, they should distribute all money to the poor for Purim, even if it's more than they need, because this is not like tzedakah all year long. This is for simcha. The ein medaktikin b'davar, and therefore we need not be careful. We need not do investigations to see who's getting the money, since the whole purpose is not supporting the poor. Since the whole purpose is increasing simcha, therefore, ein medaktikin b'davar. Therefore, you don't have to clarify, you don't have to investigate who is poor, and you don't have to investigate who is deserving and who isn't. Anyone you give the money to is going to have increased simcha. Well, of course, you want to, again, use your money to get the best simcha return that you can. You give 100 shekels to a wealthy person, not going to make much simcha there. Give the 100 shekels to someone who is destitute, well, you make a lot more simcha there. You're going to want to invest your money to get the best return you can. But as long as you are increasing simcha, you're doing the mitzvah on Purim. That's what it says in the Yerushalmi. Ein medaktikin b'ma'ot Purim ela kol aposhet yad litol no yitol. Anyone who sticks out his or her hand on Purim, you can give tzedakah to that person. No investigation is required because you're not doing it as an act of tzedakah. You're doing it on Purim as an act of Purim to increase simcha on Purim, and well, that's going to work. That's going to work even if the person is not truly deserving of contribution. That's what the way the Rosh explained it. The Ramban says, Matzati b'Yerushalmi, it says in the Yerushalmi, we need not be careful in how we distribute the money to the poor on Purim. Kol poshet yad, anyone who sticks out his or her hand, we give them money. That's the minhag. It turns out not only the Rosh on the Ashkenaz side of the divide, but the Ramban on the Sephardic side of the divide agree entirely that the nature of the donation on Purim is fundamentally different than tzedakah all year long, and therefore, since it's only intended on Purim to increase simcha, well, even if the recipient is not truly poor, not truly deserving, you are going to increase simcha, and therefore it is a fulfillment of the mitzvah. The Ritva explains, based on the same Yerushalmi, Ein medaktikin b'davar lomar imu ani ra'ui litein lo imlav. You don't have to investigate the person. You give anyone that money. Of course, you're going to want to do the best mitzvah you can and get the best increase in simcha you can by whom you're going to give it to. Therefore, the poorer, the better. But this is like Simchas Matanot. It's just like Matanot, just like Mishloach Manot. Mishloach Manot you can give to rich people because it's to increase Simcha. Mishloach Manot is also to increase Simcha and not a mitzvah of tzedakah. Well, let's see how this plays out in the Chuva of the Maharil. Im Adam Yotze mitzvahs matanas le'evyon b'mashin noten lev ma'ot shel ma'aser. This is a question which has very broad ramifications throughout the length and breadth of Torah. If you have the minhag, and you should have the minhag, the praiseworthy minhag, the commendable minhag, if you follow the good minhag of separating 1/10 of your income for tzedakah, no one ever said that you're obligated to do that. Many people incorrectly believe that there's some kind of halachic obligation to give 1/10 of one's income for tzedakah. There is no such halachic obligation, but it is a highly commendable, advisable, praiseworthy minhag. I mean, good in every sense of good. It is, but there's some distance between being good and being required. Someone who fails to give 1/10 of his or her income for tzedakah is guilty of nothing and has nothing to do tshuva for. But what can those who do have the minhag, and it is commendable and it is advisable and it is praiseworthy, not exactly required, but people who do it, what can you spend the money on? How should you distribute the Meiser money, which you've put aside 10% of your income? For example, can you use it for Matanot le'evyonim on Purim? Mi amrinin, do we say, Kevan de Meiser belav hachi shaykh lechem lo yatsa dohanose mishalahem. Maybe the Meiser money does not actually belong to the owner. The owner has already set it aside for charitable purposes. It's no money, therefore, no longer truly belongs to the owner. So you're not giving your money for matanas le'evyonim or tilma ikar takanas hu simcha. But if the whole purpose is only for simcha, this will make simcha. Bottom line, can you use Meiser money or not? Chuva. Matanot le'evyonim. In my humble opinion, my humble opinion tends to the conclusion, no one told me I had to publish this tshuva, but he chose to do so, meaning he's entirely committed to it. Lo nafik b'ma'os meiser, you cannot use Meiser money to distribute to matanot le'evyonim on Purim. Why not? Kevan de consider abundant have davar shebachova, because giving matanot le'evyonim is obligatory. And this is the fundamental rule of distributing Meiser funds. You can't use your Meiser budget. You can't use your 10%, which you've set aside for tzedakah, for anything which is chova, for anything which is obligatory. You can use your Meiser funds for any mitzvah you want, as long as it's not an obligatory mitzvah. You want to use the money for to support someone who needs dental work, fine. You're not obligated to pay for that per person's dental work. You can use Meiser money for it. But if you've already signed a contract and agreed to pay the dentist for someone's dental work, now you have an obligation to pay. And now you can no longer use Meiser money. If you want to use your Meiser budget to finance someone's dental work, that's a decision which you must make before you become obligated to pay. Once you've obligated yourself to pay for that person's dental work, you have an obligation, and you cannot use Meiser money to pay for any obligation. Examples are easy to multiply. If you want to buy a seat in the synagogue for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, well, you don't have to do that. That's not a requirement. You can use Meiser money for that mitzvah, a seat for yourself to sit in the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but you have to make that decision to use Meiser funds before you become obligated to pay for the seat. Once you've agreed to pay for the seat, now you're obligated, and it's too late to decide to use Meiser money. You want to use Meiser funds to finance your own Torah education or someone else's Torah education or your children's Torah education when they're older and no longer you're no longer obligated to continue with their education. Well, that's a mitzvah. You use Meiser money for that. But if you've already agreed to pay, already signed the contract, you're already obligated to pay, now it's too late to use Meiser money. Well, this is a rule which he formulates in terms of Matanot Le'Evyonim and Purim, but it's a rule which applies throughout. Meiser money can be used for any optional mitzvah. Buying an etrog, for example. No one said you have to buy an etrog. You could borrow someone's etrog on Sukkot. You don't have to buy your own. You can use Meiser money for that. But once you've agreed to buy the esrog, now you're obligated to pay, and it's too late to use Meiser money. Okay, let's go on to what the Rambam says. Rambam says, "Mutav la'adam laharbot b'matanot le'evyonim milaharbot b'sudato b'shiluach manot l're'eu." When preparing your budget for Purim, the amount of money that you're going to spend for matanot le'evyonim should be greater than the amount of money which you're going to spend for your own seudah, together with the money which you're going to spend for mishloach manot. How much are you going to be spending for mishloach manot plus your own seudah? The amount you give for matanot le'evyonim should exceed that amount. Ein sham simcha gedola mefuah ela l'sameach levanim yitomim almanos v'gerim. The greatest simcha is to bring simcha to those who are downtrodden, the destitute, the orphans, the widows, the converts. Misamech lev umlalimela doma l'shchina. If you can bring simcha to the people who are downtrodden, you are as good as the Shechina, the divine presence. Well, according to this, Matanot le'Evyonim is a special mitzvah for Purim, for Simcha, as we've proven over and over again. And since the greater Simcha is going to be Simcha of Matanot le'Evyonim, even greater than the Simcha that you experience in your own Suda, even greater than the Simcha that people experience when they get Matanot, when they get Mishloach Manot, well, the way to go is to emphasize Matanot le'Evyonim. In any event, the Bach, Rav Yoel Sirkis, disagrees. Rav Yoel Sirkis, author of the Bach, the Bayit Chadash. The Bayit Chadash is a commentary he wrote on the Tur. The reason he wrote this commentary, nowadays, everyone thinks of the Shulchan Aruch as being the single most definitive work in halacha ever. The Shulchan Aruch is universally accepted and universally reviewed. I don't mean to say that everyone follows every point in the Shulchan Aruch. There are disagreements here and there. There are people here and there, rabbis here and there, who disagree with certain points in the Shulchan Aruch. But in general, everyone accepts the Shulchan Aruch as being definitive and authoritative. That's true nowadays, but it was not true back in the 17th century, shortly after the Shulchan Aruch was published. Shortly after the Shulchan Aruch was published, there was a great controversy in the rabbinic world about the Shulchan Aruch. Many great rabbis back in those days, including the Bach that we're about to look at, many great rabbis back in those days did not like the Shulchan Aruch at all, and rejected the book out of hand. Their objection to the Shulchan Aruch was that the Shulchan Aruch just publishes halachot, do this, don't do that, this is permitted, this is prohibited, without giving the sources and the reasons. And many rabbis back in the early days, shortly after the Shulchan Aruch was published, back in the 17th century, many rabbis were dead set against any book like that, which publishes halachot without explanations of the reasons and the sources and the proofs. And therefore, the Bach wrote this encyclopedic commentary on the Tur Shulchan Aruch, going point by point through the whole Shulchan Aruch, through the whole Tur, explaining point by point in every siman of the Shulchan Aruch why he was unhappy with the conclusions of the Shulchan Aruch. Well, let's see what he has to say here. Kol adam afilu ani mekabel tzedakah chayav latet mema shenotnim lo l'shar evyonim bepurim. Everyone has to give money to the poor on Purim. Even the poor people. Even the poor people have to give money to other poor people. Everyone has to do that. Ein din matanot levyonim bepurim kedin shar tzedakah. Unlike other tzedakah all year long, the mitzvah on Purim is different. You're obligated to give to evyonim, rather like the 4 cups of wine on Pesach. Well, what's he talking about? In general, poverty constitutes a valid exemption from the fulfillment of mitzvahs. The halachic definition of poverty, which exempts you from the fulfillment of mitzvahs, is shishis. If fulfilling the mitzvah is going to cost more than 1/6 of your assets, you are simply exempt from fulfilling the mitzvah. That's true throughout the length and breadth of Torah. If fulfilling the mitzvah is too expensive defined as costing more than 1/6 of your total assets, then you're simply exempt from fulfilling that mitzvah, aside from a few exceptions. The few exceptions are like arba kosot, the 4 cups of wine in Leil HaSeder, that even if you live in destitute poverty, you're obligated to do. And matanot le'evyonim, even the poor, even the destitute poor who live in such poverty that they are in general exempt from other mitzvahs, they too have to fulfill the mitzvah of giving matanot le'evyonim. Afilu l'shloach manot chayavim bohanim. They even have to fulfill the mitzvah of giving mishloach manot, even though they don't have enough food to eat themselves. These are mitzvahs which are obligatory without the exemption of poverty. And we learn this from Rav Chanina. And well, we don't have to go into the background in the Gemara to prove this. Shar tzedakah kol hashana, ordinary tzedakah all year long is like any other mitzvah, and the destitute poor, for whom giving tzedakah would mean distributing more than 1/6 of their assets, they're simply exempt. The poor person is exempt from giving tzedakah all year long, but on Purim, no. And since on Purim there is an absolute obligation to give matanot le'evyonim, therefore the Bach disagrees with what we saw previously. The Bach disagrees and says you cannot use Meiser money for this, because this is an absolute obligation. Let me conclude with what Rav Elyashiv is reported to have said, Ma'ot matnot le'avyonim k'dei l'chavcham mekayimim dafka ba'ani shera'ui litain lo tzedakah v'lo b'chol ha'poshet yad. Rav Elyashiv apparently disagrees with everything that we've learned so far today. And he says, Matanot Levyonim is just like tzedakah. You don't give to anyone who sticks out his or her hand. You have to investigate and make sure that the person is truly needy. Exactly how Rav Elyashiv squares this opinion with all the sources we've seen, I have no idea. It seems to fly, his opinion seems to fly in the face of everything we've learned. But then this is not an opinion which he published himself. This is a rumor which is reported by someone who claims to have heard this from him. Therefore, a skeptical person like myself has doubts about whether or not Rav Elyashiv actually said something like this, which seems to fly in the face of all of the sources we've seen. Okay, these are the basic points regarding Matanot Levyonim, which I wanted to make today. Let me open up the floor to you and ask you if you have any questions of a halachic nature that you wish to pose.
I don't have a question. I just have a comment.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
My comment is, I food for somebody very, very poor and had asked me to Matana Levinim, and it was a very good gesture for us. And it was a ground meat or something like that. She asked me,
No,
she didn't want
now I don't hear you anymore.
She's muted. She needs to unmute herself.
Yeah, don't
Okay.
start.
I can't get it.
I'm going to turn off my picture.
Judy,
That sometimes
you have
helps.
to unmute yourself. You're muted. You're muted. You're muted. Open up your mic.
No, I think she's frozen because her image is not moving. If you hear me, Judy, if you hear me, send me an email with the question and I will respond to it, okay? Oh, I know what I can do. I can chat her.
I got thrown off after 40 minutes off the link, and I wonder if we need an extension past the 40 minutes.
No, that we paid for, I think. I'm pretty sure we paid for. Okay, we'll pause now because Judy seems to be frozen.
Right.
Just the opposite of global warming. And
Thank you.
I wish you a good Chodesh. Good Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh begins tonight. Wish you a good Shabbos and look forward to seeing you all again next week. Until then, shalom, shalom.
Also to you.
Shalom, shalom.